Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here already. We're going to be starting in 1 minute. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and lives to join us for this webinar. This is part of our Planning Smarter series. Montgomery County Planning Commission has a number of events throughout the year. And if you want more information on other events that we're having, you can go to montgomerycountypa.gov/planning-smarter. This webinar here is in collaboration with the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, which is the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. So we're really glad to partner with them for this event. We are going to start off by asking you who you are, just to know who's here. So we have a quick poll for you to let us know what your role is, and I'll tell you who we are while you're telling us who you are. So my name is Chloe Moore. I'm a principal planner at the Montgomery County Planning Commission. I'm joined by Tim Kenichi, a senior planner, Megan McNish from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and Mike Narkowicz, our assistant manager of community planning. So just take a minute and you can choose more than one option on the poll. Let us know what role you play. All right, and Tim, when you think we've got a decent response, you can go ahead and share the results so we can see who's here, who's joining us today.
All right, we just have a couple more trickling in. We're at 67 of 77 participants, so just
Okay.
give it a couple more seconds here. All right.
Okay, great. We've got a good variety of folks here. Local Historic Commission or HARB members and local government staff or consultants and interested citizens make up our largest groups, other planners and professionals, but we have a few elected officials and a good number of local planning commission members too. Great. Well, thank you all for being here. Today, we're going to start with a brief discussion of why we do historic preservation. We're going to talk about the National Register of Historic Places, what it is, what it isn't, what it does for you. We're going to spend the most time talking about regulatory tools. What kinds of options are there for regulation of historic resources? And what are some examples from the community? And then some next steps. What might you do if you want to pursue historic preservation in your community? While you're not likely to walk away from this webinar with an ordinance in hand and ready to go, hopefully you'll get a good sense of what the variety of options and ideas are out there that you might pursue and what next steps you might take. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike to get us started here.
Okay, thank you, Chloe. Again, I'm Mike Narkowicz, and I'm going to talk about historic preservation community benefits. And so what we'd like to do now is launch another poll on why you are interested in historic preservation. It's always useful to know why our audience is coming here, why you're most interested in this presentation. So you can see the answers there. And we preserve because historic resources make our communities unique. And when we preserve historic resources, we help preserve the sense of place. These have quality of life benefits, and it helps us manage change over time. It also helps us protect the resources that are important to all of our communities. And next. So, okay, I'm just going to stop for a second. We can look at our results of our poll. And so it looks like people who are concerned about preserving community character as development occurs lead the poll in responses, followed by people concerned that historic resources I care about may be threatened with demolition. And that's often a trigger for people to become interested in historic preservation. Once people are faced with the real prospect of losing something valuable to them in their community, it can really get them to rally around historic preservation. Also, people who are curious and want to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing present as well. So on this pie chart, you see a myriad of reasons we preserve historic resources, and they range from things like sustainability. The construction industry generates approximately 11% of all greenhouse gases, and building management contributes even more. And so when you preserve a resource rather than build anew, you prevent those greenhouse gases from being released. Economic development is an important reason that we preserve. In Pennsylvania, it's especially so because heritage tourism contributes a significant amount of revenues. And then when we consider things such as sense of place, that's also a very important reason that we preserve historic resources. And sense of place is especially influenced by things like physical form, like the architecture and design of a building, as well as the setting and the context surrounding it, and the neighborhood of which it is a part. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim Kenichi.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Tim Kenichi. I'm a community planner here at MCPC. I'm just going to briefly go over the National Register of Historic Places, explain what it does and does not do, and explain the role that it plays as a planning tool. The National Register was established in 1966 through the National Historic Preservation Act. It's administered by the National Park Service in concert with the state historic preservation offices. So here in PA, that's PHMC. The goal is to inventory, document, recognize the resources that have significance in the American history, architecture, engineering, archaeology, and culture that we all share. So by documenting these important resources, it allows state and local governments, as well as federal agencies and local planners like myself, to understand what resources exist where, what their significance is, and it ensures that proper mitigation occurs to avoid adverse impact as part of planning or development projects. We wanted to start here with a couple misconceptions about the National Register that we wanted to kind of dispel from the get-go. So first off, it is fairly common to believe that National Register properties are protected in some way from demolition or alteration. Unfortunately, that is not entirely true. There are some protections, and that comes into play when state or federal funding is involved with a project that has the potential to impact a resource listed in the National Register, but otherwise there are no inherent protections from demolition or alteration that would have to come from a local ordinance. Yet another potential misconception is the idea that all historic districts are to some extent the same. There really is no one-to-one relationship between the National Register historic districts and a district created through the Historic District Act in Pennsylvania. There are two separate processes that have different applications, different requirements, and when you are listed in the National Register, it does not automatically create a locally designated landmark, nor does it create a local historic district. So to quickly summarize the National Register, what it does and does not do, I want to first off state that this is always been designed to be a planning tool rather than a regulatory tool. So that's really where the local regulation comes in to regulate how these properties can be altered. So first and foremost, I want to say that recognizing those important buildings, structures, sites, objects, or districts that that are most important to the nation's history is an honor in and of itself. Being listed in the National Register is the federal government agreeing with the community that this resource potentially in your community is part of our shared history and culture as a nation. An important aspect that goes before listing is the documenting and inventorying of these resources. And that really gives us a greater understanding of what these resources are, what role they played in history, and what potential vulnerabilities they might have. That becomes increasingly important as development or planning projects occur. So when a project is funded with state or federal funding, the State Historic Preservation Office is able to go in, see all of the information about this resource, and really have stronger recommendations for how to mitigate potential adverse impacts. For planners like me doing comprehensive planning and land use policy, it's also extremely invaluable because we don't have to go out and do the legwork. There are also financial incentives associated with the National Register, primarily the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program, which allows when a building is renovated for an income-producing purpose, you can potentially recoup some of your costs with a tax credit. However, there is no guarantee for grant funding, although there are certain grant programs that are targeted at the National Register, specifically National Register listed properties. Again, to reiterate, there is no automatic creation of a local district or local landmark when something's listed in the National Register of Historic Places. There's no prevention of demolition, restriction of maintenance, repair, restoration of these buildings. And lastly, you're not automatically qualified for a PHMC historical marker, and the National Park Service does not send you a plaque recognizing the resource either. PHMC administers the state program, and then otherwise you kind of have to go out on your own to purchase a plaque. Here, I wanted to highlight a preservation wind right here in Montgomery County. This is in East Greenville Borough, one of the communities that I work with personally. This beautiful building, the Boyertown Burial Casket Factory, was listed on the National Register in 2017. Today, it sees new life as the Willows at East Greenville, which contains about 70 income-restricted apartment units. The developer was able to leverage both historic preservation tax credits by being listed on the National Register and low-income housing tax credits by having income-restricted apartments in the building to make this project more financially feasible. And for our part, MCPC was able to work with the borough to revise their zoning to allow this sort of adaptive reuse in a historically industrial building within a historic district. And last year, we recognized the project with a Montgomery Award for their work in housing equity, adaptive reuse and historic preservation, and for the community collaboration effort that went into making this project a reality. And it's been a resounding success for the community, the region, and the county. I'm going to pass it back to Megan to go over the regulatory tools specific to Pennsylvania.
Thanks so much, Tim. As was noted earlier, my name is Megan McNish. I'm the Eastern Region Community Preservation Coordinator for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, which is a bureau of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. So as Tim said, now that we've talked a little bit about the National Register program, we're going to shift gears to talk about the regulatory tools that are available to communities like yours. But first, we want to start off with a little bit of myth busting. The myth is that historic preservation ordinances will mean that you can't update your windows and someone is going to tell you what color you can or can't paint your house. The reality is that a local historic preservation ordinance and what it reviews is really up to the community. There's nothing automatic that adopting a historic preservation ordinance does at the local level. So as Mike noted earlier, the goal with preservation ordinances is to manage change to historic resources over time. So how your community does that can vary widely. You can focus on things like demolition delays or restriction of demolition, review of alterations and new construction, as well as adding additional uses and benefits for reuse of historic properties. Again, ultimately, nothing is automatic in creating a preservation ordinance, but what you choose to review must be within the scope of what's permitted through the statewide enabling legislation, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But again, the power is at the local level, so you get to decide. The next myth to conquer is that the only way to have a preservation ordinance is through a historic district. And at least 50% of properties in a given area have to be historic in order to create a district. The reality is that there are ways to designate individual resources in addition to creating historic districts, and that there's no set number of properties that must be historic in order to create a district. I do want to note here that we're talking specifically about local designation and not about the National Register program. When we talk about that, the rules are a little bit different for the National Register program. So again, now we've shifted gears and we're focusing purely on local designation options. So as we think about what options are available to us to protect our historic properties, I like to think about preservation ordinances falling on a spectrum from the fewest types of projects reviewed and least amount of oversight to the most types of projects reviewed and greatest amount of oversight. Demolition delays and review of demolition and new construction fall towards the fewer types of projects reviewed, and whereas all exterior changes lands on the more restrictive side of the spectrum. Ultimately, how you choose to protect your historic resources, though, is going to depend on the types of historic places that exist in your community, and also the types of municipal resources that you're willing to commit to support preservation regulation. So now we'll shift a little bit to talk about the two statewide enabling legislation options, the Municipalities Planning Code, or MPC, and the Historic Districts Act of 1961, or Act 167. And Tim, if you could launch the last poll we have. We want to know whether or not your community has a historic preservation ordinance, and if so, what kind. I'm going to continue talking about the different types of ordinances that exist while everyone answers that poll. So the first option in terms of statewide enabling legislation is the Historic District Act of 1961, or Act 167, which enables municipalities to designate areas of historical significance as historic districts and regulate how properties within those districts are altered, how new buildings are built, whether demolition can occur, additions. Again, the options are wide, but what you choose to review depends on you. Under Act 167, PHMC is required to certify the boundaries of the historic district. That role is performed by the State Historic Preservation Office. And to be clear, when we certify historic districts, we're primarily looking at whether or not a community has appropriately justified the boundaries of the historic district based on their local definition. That is the scope of our review is very narrow, but certification is required. Act 167 does allow for the appointment of a Historic Architectural Review Board, or HARB, and HARBs have certain required positions on their board that are created through the statewide enabling legislation. I wanted to note that specifically because HARBs require registered architects, licensed building inspectors, and licensed real estate brokers as a part of the board. And that can be a challenge for some communities to fill. So it's something to consider as you decide what may be appropriate for your community.
Here's those poll results for you.
Awesome. So the next option that I want to touch on is the Municipalities Planning Code, which enables communities to create special zoning ordinances for historic properties and enact certain benefits and restrictions on those properties. Unlike the Historic District Act, the MPC allows for designation of individual properties, particularly suited to rural and suburban settings where historic resources may be more dispersed. The MPC allows for special consideration of historic preservation when reviewing variance, subdivision, and special exception applications, and it provides opportunities for incentives to protect the character of historic resources. One thing I do want to note about these two statewide enabling legislation options is that while I called them options, you can choose to have both at the community level. You don't have to just have one. These tools can work together. And I think Chloe and Mike and Tim will have some examples that illustrate that in a little bit. Regardless of the direction that you decide to go, if you don't currently have an ordinance, I would highly encourage you to make sure that any changes that you're making are done in concert with your municipal solicitor, ideally someone who has land use experience. The State Historic Preservation Office across Montgomery County, that's going to be me, can provide assistance with ordinance development, as can some of the planners on this call. So definitely take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you there. And one last note before we move into examples, the statewide enabling legislation options are frameworks for how historic preservation can happen in a community. It's not the only way that you can create preservation outcomes. Aligning your underlying zoning, for example, with the historic uses of properties can help create preservation outcomes at the local level. And likewise, your ordinance, even if it falls within the framework that these two enabling legislation options create, there's still a lot of room for error. So you definitely take advantage of the resources that are available to you to ensure that what you're doing is setting you up for the greatest success. So with that, I will pass it along to Chloe.
Thanks so much, Megan, introducing us to the types of regulatory tools we might use. So if you were paying attention, you might have heard a clue to the answer to this one. It's a myth that historic ordinances have to place restrictions on historic properties without providing any benefits for owners. They can place only restrictions or offer only bonuses or incentives, or can do both. So a zoning under the municipality's planning code, an ordinance could offer additional uses, reduced parking, adjustments to dimensional requirements, etc. And under the Historic Districts Act or the municipality's planning code, an ordinance can place restrictions on historic properties. So could be one or the other or both. Okay, we're going to go into a few examples from Montgomery County municipalities that already have some historic preservation provisions. We have some that have zoning overlays, and I will say that as we go into notes on a few of these communities, be aware that we're not going into every detail of the ordinance. If you want to know all of the full language, you have to reference the exact code, or we're happy to talk it through with you later. So we're generalizing here to share some examples. So I'm going to just mention briefly, Horsham Township does have a zoning overlay on a number of properties. The ordinance creates a historic advisory commission. There is review and regulation of demolition. So they're going in the direction of trying to restrict or make it difficult to demolish a historic resource. But it also, the ordinance also offers some incentives, additional uses that might not be otherwise permitted by the zoning under certain conditions. And in some situations, there is the municipality or the owner may be required to do an impact study before making changes. Another example is Marlborough Township also has a zoning overlay that creates a historical commission. There's a waiting period and documentation required for demolition, but otherwise no restrictions. So it doesn't prevent demolition or attempt to make it difficult to demolish a property. It's different strategies in a different community. There are some dimensional bonuses, incentives to make it easier on a historic property owner. A couple other things about Marlborough. The Historical Commission does review alterations to historic resources, and they, similar to Horsham Township, also offer some additional uses that you can have under certain circumstances in your historic property, historic resource that may not be otherwise allowed by the zoning. All right, I'm going to turn it to Tim, who's going to mention a few examples from that use the Historic Districts Act.
Thanks, Chloe. So here in Montgomery County, we have 9 historic districts that were created pursuant to the Historic District Act. That includes the 5 townships and 4 boroughs noted on this page. And here on the right, we have a picture of a beautiful building in Norristown's local historic district. Again, I want to somewhat selfishly highlight one of the communities that I work with personally with North Wales Borough. They've had a local historic district since the year 2000 when PHMC certified their district. It covers nearly a quarter of this relatively small borough, and it encompasses their core business district, the train station area, and then the neighborhoods that kind of developed in between and outward from these historic industrial and commercial core areas. And I think that this district really exemplifies kind of the shared context, cohesion, and just the shared history and story of the community. This really is exemplified here that, you know, they're interrelated parts of a whole that all go together. So their HARB meets monthly to review permanent changes to buildings within the district. They issue certificates of appropriateness for window replacements, siding replacements, roofing replacements, and they pay particular attention to signage because all of their Main Street and generally speaking, most of their commercial areas are within their historic district, so signage is, of course, an important part of the built environment. They do not look at non-permanent changes such as paint or interiors, and they are limited to looking at 2 street-facing facades. They offer some design guidelines on their website that are aimed at helping applicants to understand both, you know, what is this historic resource, what would the appropriate treatment be, and what's under HARB's review. And the borough has also been certified as a certified local government, which is a National Park Service recognition and application process that really just recognizes that the borough kind of goes above and beyond with historic preservation planning. And they also have certain targeted zoning regulations related to adaptive reuse, although they don't have an overlay. And I'll pass it back to Chloe.
Thanks, Tim. Just go through one more myth and reality fact, and then some more examples. So I know that I've heard community concern about our statewide historic preservation office, PHMC, and how much they'll be involved if your municipality decides to have some kind of preservation ordinance. We think that PHMC is an excellent resource. Megan is really nice and very helpful, but for the most part, their role is just advisory. And they certainly do not get involved in administration and regulation of an ordinance once it's adopted. We recommend working with PHMC to draft an ordinance along with our staff can also assist with that. And they do play one important role, as mentioned previously, in certifying the boundaries if you decide that you want to go with a local historic district. But PHMC does not get otherwise involved and is not going to be, you know, attending your local meetings and making decisions on the local level. It's really up to the local municipality. And a couple other misconceptions. Can the government stop the owner from demolishing their building? And do private property owners have to agree to be part of it? And the answer is yes. For the most part, it is possible to stop demolition, although there's a couple kind of escape valves required. And a municipality can designate a property as a historic resource through a local ordinance without owner agreement or approval. For your information. Okay, one example that we wanted to mention is sort of one of the lightest touch ordinances in Montgomery County. Hatfield Borough has a zoning overlay that introduces a demolition delay of 80 days and no other restrictions or review. So if that's kind of the direction that your municipality wants to go, there is an example of a municipality that is doing that. And the demolition delay can be ended early by a vote of council. And then we're going to share 2 examples here of municipalities that are using both a historic district, have 1 or more historic districts under the Historic Districts Act, and use some of the zoning overlay tools to in concert together to achieve their preservation goals. So the first example is from Narberth. They have a local historic district certified by PHMC with a number of review requirements. It identifies contributing properties, restricts demolition, and certain types of alterations require review. Narberth has also introduced a zoning overlay, which does not identify any additional properties. They're just using it to add dimensional incentives and use incentives for properties that are already identified under the historic district. So that's an example of one way that these 2 regulatory tools can be used together. And then Mike is going to share an example of a different way that these tools can be used together.
Thank you, Chloe. I'm going to talk about Lower Merion Township. They have a couple different examples. They have Harb District, historic districts, that is, and then they also have a zoning overlay, the Historic Resource Overlay District. On this map, you see the resources which are protected. In red are the historic districts, and this includes a few of the high character village areas in the township, such as the Ardmore Commercial District, the Haverford Station District, the Gladwin Historic District, and Marion Friends Meeting, which is right on the edge of Narberth. There are also individual resources on their historic resource inventory that are protected by the overlay district. There are nearly 400 properties identified under the historic districts and over 800 identified under zoning. Some of the resources are located in both. The historic district involves the Harb reviewing and advising on issuing a certificate of appropriateness. And this addresses the following activities when visible from the public right of way: new construction, reconstruction, alterations, demolitions, additions. And it doesn't just apply to buildings and major structures, but also applies to fences, walls, signs, and garden structures. The historic district involves considering the impact of a proposed development on the district itself. So it considers how changes, how restorations affect the context. And just to give you a sense of the timeline, it's typical for a certificate of appropriateness application to have a 3 to 4 week turnaround before a building permit is issued. However, if the Harb recommends changes, that could be prolonged a bit to several months. And another topic is paint colors, another topic which often comes up in historic preservation. And when communities are considering whether they want to create a historic preservation ordinance, sometimes there's a lot of fear that it has to regulate paint color, and it can, but it doesn't have to. Now, in cases like Lower Merion's districts, where you have very intact areas with contiguous areas that are historic, that have a strong sense of design and a particular style, then it may be more appropriate to regulate things like that. And so paint colors are generally reviewed within the historic districts in Lower Merion. The zoning overlay, the Historic Resources Overlay District, is important because it provides use incentives by offering additional uses by conditional use. And that requires the applicant demonstrate the historic integrity of the resource will be preserved. It requires a historic resources impact study. It requires permanent protection through means such as a covenant or a conservation easement. Some examples of the use incentives are conversions to multifamily, limited retail and office. And these are really limited quite substantially to ensure there are no negative impacts in the surrounding area. You could have a community center, you could have a B&B or accessory dwelling unit. And in exchange, the township gets a preserved building and preserved historic integrity of that building. Just to give you some more examples of the controls, although the use incentive includes the ability to establish a retail use, there are limits to repair and food preparation and catering, and the repair is itself limited. And then there are other limits on access, residency, the size of the expansion is limited to 5%, number of employees, for some cases, separation requirements and buffering requirements. The zoning overlay also involves review of the proposed change. In this case, it's by the Historical Commission, unless the resource is also in a historic district, in which case the HARB takes over. And it looks at the impact on other historic resources on site and on adjacent properties. Parking or signage requirements may also be modified. The zoning overlay offers dimensional relief to impervious coverage and to setbacks. And I thought it was interesting that this historic resource inventory also includes historic street signs. There are some substantial beloved historic street signs in Lower Merion, and so as a result, they are on the inventory. I would note also the township has amended building code to be consistent with the historic resources overlay district and the historic districts. And I do want to give credit to Greg Pritchard, the historic preservation planner for Lower Merion, for these photos, for additional context and background. So he was a tremendous help. And now I'll hand it back to Megan.
Thanks, Mike. So now that we've talked about the regulatory options and some examples, we did want to touch briefly on how you even get started with protecting your historic resources. So on this slide, I've got a flow chart. I do want to really emphasize, though, that these are some recommendations for things to consider. It's not a prescriptive method by any means. These are just some options that as you move through the process of creating a preservation program at the local level, you may want to consider doing. So the first item is historic resource survey and inventory. We talked earlier about the fact that creating a preservation ordinance is really about managing change to historic resources over time. And in order to make good decisions about historic properties, you need to have good information on them. So starting with a historic resource survey, or if you have one already that's more than 5 or 10 years old, updating that information is always a good idea. The next item is public outreach and community engagement. Talking to your residents or your fellow residents about what they care about in relation to historic resources. Is it overall community character, or is it specific buildings? You may also want to discuss other community wants and needs. A great example might be if you need a walkable grocery store in your community, and that's a need that's not currently being met. Perhaps there's a way that preservation can help create or solve that problem. It may not always happen, but it's something worthy of consideration. The next item is going to be assessing your resources. And by resources, I mean municipal resources. What is your municipality willing to commit to support preservation activities? Whether it's a full-time preservation planner or assistance from a planner that's already on staff, or a codes official, building inspector, et cetera, having that support from a municipal level may determine what the best option for you, what the best option is for you in terms of creating regulation. The next item is identifying your context, your historic context. What about your community do you want to protect? Again, like I said earlier, is it overall historic fabric, or is it specific resources? The next item is align your underlying zoning with your preservation goals. And I would say in general, this goes for whether you choose to create a preservation ordinance or not. A good way to think about this would be if you have a historic residential area that now is zoned to allow for light industrial use and buildings that are significantly taller than what exists there currently. That is in many ways incentivizing the demolition of these historic resources rather than their preservation. So if you align your zoning to ensure that either the historic use of properties is permitted or adjacent sensitive uses are permitted, that can really help support preservation outcomes in your community. The next item is creating a historical commission or HARB. I mentioned earlier that HARBs have certain required positions, so making sure that you have a plan for how you're going to staff those boards. Do you have many people in your community that can fill those positions, or are you going to be continuing to search for additional help and volunteers to support the activities of the HARB or Historical Commission? Next is draft and adopt your ordinance. It probably seems like it took us quite a while to get here, but there's a reason for that. And that is because it takes a lot of work prior to even starting to draft an ordinance to really get to the point where you're ready to do that. You need to know what resources you have, what your community is interested in, what your community can support before you start writing and drafting an ordinance. And then last, but certainly not least, continuing education and training and ongoing community outreach. This is maybe the most important part of the whole flow chart that I have up here. Ensuring that your preservation review body, your elected officials are continuing to stay up to date on historic preservation and best practices, getting reminders on running meetings and Robert's rules and all the technical aspects of being a regulatory or quasi-judicial body is really important, and continuing to educate homeowners on the benefits of historic preservation and how they can go about protecting their properties. And then revisiting your ordinance and your survey is also really important, making sure that your information stays up to date and that any aspects of your ordinance that maybe aren't quite working as intended are rectified and addressed moving forward. So if you haven't been scared away by all of the things that I gave you to think about, and you'd like to move forward with collecting information about your historic resources, you don't necessarily have to start from zero. The PA SHPO does maintain information collected about historic resources in Pennsylvania, and that information is available via PA Share, which is our online data management tool. We rely pretty heavily on information that's shared with us from communities or members of the public, so it's certainly not an exhaustive resource. There are many, many, many historic places in Pennsylvania that are not captured in PA Share. So it is not the end all and be all, but it is a place to start. But on the flip side, if you have information about a historic place in your community that you'd like to share with us, we'd be very happy to have it. We often find that the best known historic places at the community level are the ones we have the least information about. So don't assume that just because it's well known that we have lots of information on it already. And I'd be happy to provide any assistance needed for folks that are looking to access PA Share. So last, but certainly not least, some additional things to consider beyond the creation of your preservation program. And I included a picture here on the slide of a well, and going down the rabbit hole is my corny joke here, but it can feel like that sometimes as you think about all the things that you can do to support your preservation program. But here are just a few. Adopting design guidelines can be a great tool to assist your HARB or your historical commission and applicants in moving through the design review process for a preservation project. You can consider becoming a certified local government or CLG, and I won't get too into that because that's a whole other lengthy presentation. Consider adding a Main Street to your community, a Main Street program. Not many folks know that the Main Street program was created by the National Trust for Historic Preservation based on the idea that economic development happens through preservation of the places that make our community special. You may also want to connect with other communities in your area that are doing preservation, whether it's to host collaborative continuing education and training programs, or just to get a sense of what it's like regulating preservation in your area. You may find that there are lots of similarities, or maybe there are some differences, but it's just good to have that camaraderie. And then the last two items I would say are the most important on this list. Make sure to celebrate your successes. Preservation ordinances create opportunities for preservation outcomes at the local level, and that's not something to sort of brush off as insignificant. It's really important, and the historic places that we're trying to protect are really the reason why we even go about doing all of this. So make sure to celebrate those successes and those historic places that matter. So I will then pass it on to Chloe for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much to my fellow presenters and to all of you who've attended. We're about to move to Q&A, but I just wanted to say two things. One is that Tim, Megan, Mike, and I are all really interested in this topic, and we are happy to engage with you later. So please keep in touch with us. We'd love to chat. And the other thing is I just want to express a special thank you to Megan for joining us for this Planning Smarter event from PHMC. She's the real expert here, and she's really excellent to work with. So thanks to Megan and everyone here. And we have gotten some robust dialogue here in the Q&A box, and we're going to take a couple of those questions live. Feel free to keep adding them. Okay, so here's a good one that you could take, Megan. We have a question that says, at any point in the application or establishment of a historic district, is input from a certified archaeologist or historian required?
So it's not required in the pre-planning portion of the process. Certainly we're available to you for assistance, but if you don't want it, that's fine too. But we are required to certify historic districts that are created under the Historic District Act.
Right, so there's no requirement that an architect get involved in the creation of the district.
Correct.
No prohibition either. Okay, I'll throw this one to you, Megan, too. How about support for property owners whose property is covered by some kind of historic preservation ordinance? Suggested contractors, other resources that might be available to people who own properties that are considered historic resources locally.
Sure. So we don't have a ton of financial incentives available at the state level for individual property owners that are, not nonprofits or that own income producing properties. Just for, regular old homeowner, we unfortunately don't have a whole lot. But there are local organizations that have, recommended contractor lists. I know Heritage Conservancy maintains a list of contractors that do work in Montgomery County. So they're definitely worth contacting if you have a need for a contractor. Our office doesn't, the SHPO, I should say, does not maintain lists like that because we can't recommend any specific contractor or anything of that nature.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'll take one. There's a couple of questions along this line about a HARB, which stands for Historic Architectural Review Board. That would be with a historic district under the Historic Districts Act, or a historical commission, or a historic society or nonprofit organization. So if your municipality has an ordinance, either through the Historic Districts Act or through zoning, that regulates something about historic resources, the best recommendation is that there's a municipally appointed, like by your elected officials, and appoint a HARB or a historic commission, that those members are selected and appointed by your elected officials. And in Pennsylvania, all boards and commissions are advisory to the elected officials. They do not have any actual regulatory power, but they conduct whatever reviews may be required. They may make recommendations for changes to the ordinance or new properties to designate, or adjustments to the boundaries if you have a district. So that would be, you have a local ordinance, your elected officials appoint some sort of advisory board or commission to assist with administering and regulating and making recommendations related to the ordinance. There are also many wonderful nonprofit independent historic societies throughout Montgomery County and throughout Pennsylvania. And those historic organizations can provide an informal advisory role by attending a meeting of the elected officials and voicing their ideas or concerns, or they may be even asked by elected officials to provide some input or information, but because they're not appointed by the elected officials, they don't serve this official advisory role to the elected officials in a municipality. So I hope that answers. There were like 3 different questions related to that. That answers that one. Okay, there's a lot of other questions, which is amazing. We can try, we're going to take some more questions live, but we can also try to get back to all of the attendees here with some additional responses. Okay, can forests and open space be designated as historic resources? Megan, you want that one?
Sure, I can take that as well.
Okay.
Yes. Anything's possible and, in many respects. But we often find that historic landscapes are or can be designated. It's a complicated process from a local standpoint, but it can be something that the National Register program can be well suited for. But again, it gets a little bit complicated, but the short answer is yes.
Yeah, one example is sometimes there's like a historic battlefield or something that gets designated. There's maybe nothing built there right now, or maybe it's not really whatever building is there, but it's the land. So that can happen. Okay.
I was going to say, you've had a couple of questions about resources, including financial resources that are available to people who might have something old on their hands.
We pretty much answered that, I think.
Okay.
Basically being that probably the best resource would be the 2-county organization. What are they called? The Heritage Conservancy, who, well, I guess there are a question about recommended contractors, et cetera. The Heritage Conservancy does provide some information on that. And then in terms of financial resources, if what you're doing is repairing like a private building for private use, there's not necessarily a lot of resources available. If it's an income producing property, like a business, there may be tax credits available. And then the county has a program that is not about historic preservation, but there is some assistance for low income homeowners. And you might have more information about that than I do.
Well, we do have a basic home repairs program that is still getting off the ground that is offered through our Office of Housing and Community Development. I don't have the exact details on it, but if there's someone who is interested in that type of resource, it is for low income homeowners. And I don't know how low income you have to be to qualify, but I'm happy to pass along information, or at least a contact name to anyone who's interested in that type of program.
I did see that there was a question about whether or not communities could create those types of programs on their own. And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. There are some great examples. Erie, the city of Erie, out all the way in Western Pennsylvania, has a pretty robust facade grant program that they use. It's supported by some community development block grant funds, as well as a funding source through the Department of Community and Economic Development, or DCED. And I'd be happy to share that information on if there's interest in that.
Great. Tim, you flagged a couple of these questions as one that should be answered live. Is there one you want to start off and answer to, and then we can chime in if needed be?
Yeah, there's a couple questions about what factors go into determining the boundary for a historic district. And there was a question if being based solely on, quote, being old is enough for PHMC to certify the boundary. And Megan actually came out to North Wales with me a couple weeks ago, and we walked around to discuss this question. So Megan, if you want to handle that.
Sure. So whether or not PHMC certifies a historic district is based on, again, whether or not the community has shown through their boundary and their definition of a historic district that that district is justified. So in general, I would say that while it is possible that something can be designated for, or a district could be designated for just being old, typically the definition of a historic district at the local level includes some other kind of significance. So often what we see is, is 50 years old or older and contributes to the overall patterns of development in municipality name, or, includes residences of individuals or events significant to local history. So yes, but no.
Right, and the part of one of those questions was also about what determines if a resource is considered historic locally, and that is just like most of the rest of the things about how your ordinance works and what it does. It's up to the municipality. So you create, like Megan said, some kind of local criteria about what should be considered historic in your community, and then you determine if an individual resource meets those criteria, and that's how it would be considered historic. So it's not based, like, we're not telling you, PHMC isn't telling you it has to be, this is what defines historic. You get to also identify that yourself in your community. Okay, let's go have maybe one or two more questions. Okay, here's a good one. What is the best way to use provisions in zoning to protect demolition of historic resources? Should demolition be made a conditional use or special exception, or can demolition just be outright not allowed in the overlay? That's a great question. If that's your main goal, is to try to prevent demolition of your important historic resources and you want to use zoning, what's the best way to do that? The best way to do it is to have a really well-written, robust ordinance that is up to date on the latest of any case law or anything else that's come out around this topic. And that would include having really good, clear criteria for what constitutes a historic resource in your community, a really transparent process of identifying what your zoning overlay applies to and how a resource gets added to the zoning overlay. Really well-written and clear criteria for when a resource can be demolished. There's usually needs to be some kind of provision for health and safety. And so you just want to make sure that you've written that clearly and carefully, and then follow your own regulations about anything. And when a proposal comes through, should follow the process. Usually with zoning, it would be some sort of locally appointed historic commission gets to review it first and offer a recommendation to the elected officials, who can then say, this doesn't meet our criteria for demolition of a historic resource, can deny this proposal and request that the applicant seek another use for the property. It makes it more palatable to the community if you offer something, you can't demolish your property, but you can do these other things with it that wouldn't otherwise be allowed by zoning, or you can offer other benefits, dimensional incentives, reductions in parking requirements, other things like that. But those are not required. Any other panelists want to add to that about preventing demolition through zoning overlay? No. Okay, I guess I did all right. Question, oh my gosh, all these things went away. About the Main Street, Elm Street program and facade grant program funding. Do you have the latest on that, Megan?
I believe that you still do have to be a Keystone community in order to receive that funding. But you don't necessarily need to rely on the DCED funding to create a facade grant program. That's just typically where many communities source their funding from for those types of programs. It's something that can be done independent of that. So yes, you do need to be a Keystone community though.
And that would be a great question to ask someone, get more information from DCED on that, because they're going to know the latest on their various funding programs. Well, I think we're going to wrap it here because it's right at 1 o'clock. We're really grateful to everyone who attended this webinar. It was excellent attendance and great questions and interaction. If you already have some kind of ordinance provisions, revisit them occasionally and make sure they're working for you and that they're doing what you want them to do. And if you don't, please reach out to any of us for support if you'd like to work towards creating those in your community. Thank you so much, everyone.